To my presentation titled On the Objectivity of Percy Fawcett and His Amazonian Adventures. This is being presented by Rowan Donnelly for the class ANT 4930, Archaeology and Film. This is the video format. I just made a presentation to kind of help with just clarity and present and just kind of act as a script, but also kind of act as a good way to format. So let's get into it. First slide is introduction, and according to the movie The Lost City of Z, which was directed by acclaimed director James Gray, Percy Fawcett was a complex and ambitious 19th and early 20th century adventurer. And I will note he was in real life a lot more analytical and intelligent with his approach to these Amazonian adventures than he was presented to be in film. In the film, he was kind of portrayed as this somewhat capable but also very naive and unintelligent explorer who just kind of went into the jungle with no forethought and expected to come out of it alive simply because of hospitality. And also it made this assumption that these natives all spoke the same language and all spoke Spanish, even though that's not necessarily accurate to the time and the context of his adventures. But just getting that aside, within the film, Fawcett leads a successful expedition into the Amazon, and on it he finds shattered pieces of pottery in an area of the jungle previously inhabited by white men. And I didn't write this, but this part was explained by a native tribesman who acted as a guide for him. And this was kind of where he first gained his obsession for finding the lost city of Z, because before this he hadn't found any definitive evidence of the lost city of Z, but now this is like, okay, there's pottery here. This is relatively complex, which suggests signs of a complex society, which kind of fought the notion of the British Empire at the time having this opinion that these natives could not possibly have a complex society simply because they were natives. But this motivates Fawcett to then pursue the supposed lost city of Z almost religiously for years, despite the numerous casualties his adventures endure, just either because of ambushes from natives or oversight from his end, where towards the later part of the film, his crew are not willing to keep going, but he basically forces them to. And I don't remember exactly if that led to more casualties, but it's just stuff like that where Fawcett prioritizes finding the lost city of Z over the welfare of his group. And that is also really well exampled by the character Dr. Murray in the group, who was part of the Royal Geographical Society that Fawcett was a part of and leading these expeditions for. Dr. Murray was not necessarily an adventurer by any means and was not prepared for the adventure and was not in shape for it, and over time got sick. And Fawcett did make a few attempts to help him, but not anything meaningful and not to an extent that would actually ensure like a safety of Dr. Murray, and Murray ends up having to be sent off to a colony to be looked at by a doctor, which Fawcett did provide the last horse and resources for, so there is that, which shows that even with his obsession of finding Lost City Z, Fawcett was still able to at least have some sort of care for his crew and gave merit to the idea that his crew mattered. And then this is also just a continuation. Throughout the film, there is also distinct racism from the British Empire, because the British society at the time saw natives as very savage-like or just outright savages, which Fawcett disagreed with, and they viewed them mostly negatively. Fawcett, like, there was this one scene in the movie where Fawcett was up on this pulpit-looking thing where he was talking to a ton of British aristocracy, and he basically said that they could perform complex societies that could be even older than the British society, and basically everyone laughed, which is probably the strongest example I have for this kind of thought logic within the British Empire during Fawcett's time, because this is also a large part of when the British Empire was expanding territorially, and also just expanding its colonial institutions, such as the Royal Geographical Society, um, which kind of acted as a scout for the empire. In the lead up to Fawcett's famous and fatal journey in the film, he is seen hyping up his journey in hopes of finding funding and adventures to come along, or venturers to come along. That's where he was talking to the aristocracy, like I just mentioned. And he also hopes to change the notion of Amazonian natives being native savages, which ultimately gets him and his crew killed when they ran into hostile and opposing factions of natives, because he made an uneducated assumption and said and assumed that they spoke Spanish, which they didn't, and assumed that they would be hospitable, which they weren't. Um, but yeah, this is a character analysis of Percy Fawcett. Throughout the film, he is shown to be amicable, a little trusting, both of his um, crewmates and of the natives. Smart, naive, analytical, and tolerant. I say smart because he did still plan for the journey in the films. And I say naive because he was a little too trusting at times, even when he was being shot at by natives and could be killed swiftly and saw his crewmate get killed right in front of him. He still tried to go the hospitable and peaceful route. Um, and I do say tolerant because he was generally very tolerant of his crewmates, even when they were mutinying against him, even though that was never formally a thing. But when Dr. Murray, um, like, he messed up a lot of the food after Fawcett basically kicked him out of the group because he just wasn't healthy enough to keep going. But throughout the film, Fawcett is seen forgiving groups of people who had actually just basically said that. Um, but yeah, I mean, he was very tolerant and accepting of people over the film. I think as kind of a dramatization of that side of him. I don't think he was really like that in real life. This is also a film after all. This is a continuation of his character analysis. So Fawcett's nature tended to cloud his judgment, and in times of self-defense, he chose to be peaceful in order to maintain his notion and continuity of his views of the natives. And Fawcett's obsession with the Velocity also heavily influenced his decision making after his first journey, as he confirmed to himself of its existence and made his entire existence revolve around discovering the lost city of Z, even forsaking his family sometimes for the sake of finding the lost city of Z. And this also course of action led to Fawcett becoming estranged from his family, especially after the outbreak of World War II or World War One. But it also did eventually grow them together because he lost sight temporarily, and they kind of banded together, and that did end up kind of making the family come together because after that, Fawcett was no longer physically able to go on these journeys, even after recovering his sight. And this is the context of the Amazon. And then the image is simply just like the behind the scenes of the filming of the movie. But basically, numerous tribes lived and thrived within the Amazon, with a notable group being the Kuikuro, who were never mentioned by name in the film, but were just kind of an example of of how the Amazonian natives lived during the time, at least through the film. And the Kuikuro were largely hospitable to Fawcett and his party. And again, they're not mentioned by name, but they were notably hospitable in real life, and Amazonian natives, and they were present in the Amazon during Fawcett's time. So it's just kind of a general example. And they allowed them to land their plane there on their second journey on their land, and were an advanced society. And this affirmed part of Fawcett's notion of the Amazon natives being equal to Britain in terms of societal development, believing them to be more than just savages. This was in part what fed Fawcett's obsession. He wanted to prove people wrong. Obsession was Fawcett mad or a mad genius? Many of Fawcett's ideas and ideals were considered radical for the time. Britain during the 19th and early 20th centuries was very colonialist and imperialist, viewing it as a means of civilizing an uncivilized group of peoples, kind of justifying their imperial goals and going overseas and starting all of these colonies. Especially, I mean, they weren't terribly active in South America, to my knowledge. They only had I think it was Suriname, but they did still interact with the continent quite a bit through colonial institutions and stuff like that. So yeah, just trying to figure out my notes a little bit more because my notes are terribly well organized. Um, but this also highlights themes of racism and prejudice heavily present throughout the lost city of Z. Many Brits, or Brits is kind of a or a colloquial version of British people, rejected the theory of a great society having ever existed within the Amazon due to their racist and imperialist ideals. In conclusion, I would argue that by modern standards, Fawcett was not capable of objectively analyzing evidence, but by his standards of his age, I would argue he analyzed evidence in a semi-objective manner, because while he did like kind of plan out his route, he did analyze the people living there. I think he kind of had these rose-tinted glasses about it. He kind of disregarded any threat of danger, didn't take any I don't think he took any weaponry. Um, and just in general, he made a lot of assumptions that led to a lot of failures for his expeditions. Um, Hence why I say he did objectively analyze some evidence and data, but not all the time and not as objectively as he could have. And he did not immediately reject the notion of a great society existing overseas simply because of racism or prejudice, but went to the Amazon to prove it himself if this theorized culture ever existed, which he never definitively proves, but he never definitively disproves it either. And Fawcett's attempts at proving the Amazon could produce complex society ultimately paved the way for later expeditions into the Amazon, because it did give people a lot of like just more knowledge about an area they didn't were not very well versed in before. But yeah, and then this is just the clarification. The Kurikuro not mentioned by name in the film. I'm also not sure. I don't think the plane part is also mentioned in the film. That's also just another general example of um, like the how Fawcett and his party interacted with the natives. I think the plane part was from the other movie we watched, and I just made a mix up of the two. But I'm going to keep that part in because I think it is a good example of um, how they were, and the natives were overly hospitable to Fawcett and his party for a large part of the time. It was just that very last part, and I think there was one other ambush, but that very last part where he ended up. It's not really concrete what happened to him, but it's pretty obvious that they were not alive after the fact, because at the end of the movie, his wife is seen like mourning him and all that, and just kind of denying that he even died, but there's never any confirmation from him after this last journey, and they're kind of seen like it's the natives were kind of seen getting him and his son ready for like some kind of ritual sacrifice type thing. But this is the bibliography I used. I am going to go back and read all the in-text citations. I just wanted to read through first, just to give you a good idea of what my presentation looks like. In my presentation, these are all the links to all of the articles accessed by me for this presentation. And thank you for watching. Now I'm just going to go back and kind of explain the in-text citations. So David Grant talks about just the lost city of Z in general, and Fawcett's obsession with it. That's why I use him for this example. Edwards, I don't know if his last name is Said or Said, but I'm gonna say Said. He talked about like British society and how like the Brits viewed the Amazonian natives in a racist kind of ideal. So I used him as an example here and used this article for instance. There's none on this page because this is just kind of generally talking about his personality, which is from the film, obviously. Um, And then this is talking about this is Scott also talks about Fawcett's obsession, hence why I use that as an example here. And obviously, I'm going to also write in the movie as an example. I just forgot to include that in this film. Um, but yeah, I think there's one more. Yeah, and then Heckenberger just talks about Amazonian civilizations in general. It is a science journal about it, so it has some credibility. Um, and that's why I use that for this example to kind of give you an example of how Fawcett and his party were interacting with natives. And I think while the plane part, I'm not 100% sure was in the film, I know that there was a boat scene, I think, where they were taken in by natives um, when they were ambushed, and then they kind of peacefully made peace with the natives and then were taken back to their camp. And this one is also talking about Fawcett's ideas and British colonialism and imperialism. Um, and over here is kind of like what the movie portrays the natives to be, and then this is also what they're like in real life. Um, so it's not terribly inaccurate, but it's not the most accurate thing in the world. That's all of them. I'm just going to go back just to give you a longer look at them. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Peace.